So, I just found out that for 2,400 years, the medical establishment had a diagnosis that basically meant, woman I cannot currently deal with. That's not a bit, that's the actual range. The diagnosis was called hysteria. The word comes from the Greek hystera, which means uterus. So already, in the name of the disease, you have the cause of the disease, which is, and I want to be clear about this, having a uterus. Hippocrates, 4th century BCE, looked at the human body and decided that the uterus was a small, angry animal that wandered around inside women like a Roomba with an attitude problem. When it got stuck somewhere it shouldn't be, women got sick. That was the theory. That was the medical consensus. 2 stars, would not recommend. Management unresponsive for approximately 24 centuries. The treatment, by the way, was pleasant. You'd put nice smells near the part of the body where you wanted the uterus to go, and bad smells near the part where you wanted it to leave. Like a uterus is a cat. Look, I am not making this up. I wish I were. Hippocrates writes this down, and because he's Hippocrates, every doctor for the next 2 millennia just nods and goes, yeah, the wandering uterus. Makes sense. Next patient. Galen picks it up. The medieval physicians pick it up. The Renaissance physicians pick it up. At no point in this entire chain does one guy raise his hand and go, hey, has anyone actually checked? Like with their eyes? Nobody. Not one. The wandering uterus stays in medical textbooks the way a typo stays in a group project nobody wants to reread. I should mention, since I'm about to spend the next 20 minutes confidently summarizing 2.5 millennia of medical malpractice, that I am a board-certified vibes historian and unlicensed footnote enthusiast. Credentials issued by myself to myself last Tuesday. Anyway, here's where it gets useful. And by useful, I mean evil. By the 19th century, hysteria had become the single most common diagnosis given to women in the Western world. Not because women were getting sicker, because the diagnosis had quietly evolved into something extremely convenient. You could be diagnosed with hysteria for the following: anxiety, irritability, sexual desire, lack of sexual desire, fainting, not fainting enough, insomnia, talking too much, talking too little, wanting a divorce, refusing to want a divorce, writing in a journal, fluid retention, a tendency to cause trouble, and I had to read this twice, being unhappy with your husband. That last one is in the historical record. That is a documented symptom. Now hiring, husband haver. Must present with cheerful demeanor and no opinions. Competitive compensation in the form of not being institutionalized. Growth opportunities limited. Yeah, so that happened. You can see the appeal, right? From a doctor's perspective, from a husband's perspective, from a society's perspective, you have a diagnosis that is shaped exactly like a woman who is annoying you. Whatever she's doing, that's the symptom. The shape of the disease is whatever shape the inconvenience is. You did not need to invent a new condition. You already had one. It had been on the shelf since Hippocrates, and it fit every single time. The system is the villain here. I want to be careful about that. Most individual 19th century doctors were not sitting in their offices going, I shall now invent a fake disease to oppress women. They were going to medical school, opening the textbook, reading the chapter on hysteria, memorizing the symptoms, passing the exam, and then seeing those symptoms in every woman who walked in the door. Which is what happens when you give people a checklist, and the checklist is vibes. The Victorians took hysteria and ran with it. Ran is the wrong word. Sprinted. Hysteria became, in the 19th century, a full-blown industry. Doctors specialized in it. Sanatoriums were built for it. Women were sent away for months at a time for rest cures, which sometimes meant being confined to a bed in a darkened room and not being allowed to read, write, or have visitors, because thinking was considered a contributing factor to the condition. Thinking. The act of thinking. They had the woman, they had the room, they had the diagnosis, and the prescription was, stop doing that. Charlotte Perkins Gilman wrote a short story about this called The Yellow Wallpaper. She wrote it because her own doctor prescribed her this exact rest cure, and she went, in her words, perilously close to losing my mind. Her doctor's name was Silas Weir Mitchell. He was extremely famous, and his prescription for women experiencing depression was, do not work, do not write, do not think, lie down. He prescribed the opposite to men. For men, the cure was vigorous outdoor activity. For women, the cure was a darkened room and silence. Same doctor, same era, same diagnosis, different prescription based on which patient he wanted to keep quiet. Cool, 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 cool. We need to talk about the treatment, because the rest cure was one option. But for many women diagnosed with hysteria in the 19th century, there was a different treatment that was performed in the doctor's office, written up in medical journals, taught in medical schools, and listed. And this is the part that broke me, in the Merck Manual. If you don't know what the Merck Manual is, it's the medical reference book. It's the book. It has been published since 1899, and it is, to this day, one of the most widely used medical textbooks on the planet. If your doctor has a shelf, the Merck Manual is on the shelf. It is the joy of cooking of being a physician. The 1899 edition lists as a standard treatment for hysteria, pelvic massage, performed by a physician in the office, until the patient achieved what was clinically termed hysterical paroxysm. I want to sit in this for a second. A hysterical paroxysm is, and the medical literature of the time is extremely committed to the bit here, described as a sudden release of tension, flushed face, rapid breathing, and subsequent calm. The doctors writing this down in Latinate medical language were, to the best of every modern historian's reading, describing an orgasm. They were describing it as a medical event. They were billing for it. The patient was paying. There is a receipt. This study examines the systemic recategorization of female sexual response as a clinical endpoint, performed in office settings under the rubric of therapeutic intervention. Findings suggest that the medical establishment presented with the choice between acknowledging female sexuality and inventing an entirely new disease category to avoid acknowledging it, chose option 2. Further research is ongoing. Funding provided by approximately every man with a medical degree between 1850 and 1920. I want to flag something here because this is where the historical record gets contested. There's a popular version of this story. You've maybe seen it in a movie. There was a whole film called Hysteria in 2011 where Victorian doctors were performing this treatment so often that they invented the vibrator out of pure exhaustion of the wrist. That specific claim, the vibrator as medical labor-saving device claim, comes from a 1999 book by historian Rachel Maines. And in 2018, a pretty thorough academic review and Yale School of Medicine has weighed in on this as recently as 2021, pushed back hard. The pushback says, the evidence that pelvic massage was performed regularly by mainstream physicians as a routine office treatment is thinner than the popular story suggests. Some doctors did it, many did not. The vibrator invention claim is, at minimum, oversimplified. But, and this is the part the pushback does not erase, the Merck Manual listed it, in print, as treatment. The textbook said the thing. Whether every doctor on Main Street was actually doing it is genuinely debated. Whether the medical establishment officially endorsed it as therapy is not debated. It's right there. 1899. Page printed. Ink dry. The historians are arguing about the volume. They are not arguing about whether it was on the menu. Great system. Moving on, because we are not even at the worst part yet. The worst part is what hysteria was used to do to women beyond office visits. Because once a woman was diagnosed, that diagnosis followed her. A diagnosed hysteric could be committed to an asylum by her husband or father with 2 doctors' signatures. She could lose custody of her children. She could lose control of her own money. She could be subjected to surgical intervention. Specifically, and I cannot stress that this was a real procedure performed on real women, the removal of the ovaries as a treatment for emotional instability. This was called an oophorectomy. It was performed thousands of times in the late 19th century specifically to cure women of being upset. Upset about what? Often things any reasonable person would be upset about. A bad marriage, grief, the death of a child, being prevented by law from owning property or voting or working. The treatment for the emotional consequences of having no rights was surgery, to remove the part of you that was apparently causing you to notice you had no rights. This was not a fringe practice. This was published. This was peer-reviewed. This was Yale and Johns Hopkins and the Royal Society. The most credentialed medical minds in the Western world looked at women suffering under a system that gave them no power. Then they concluded that the problem was the woman's anatomy. History is wild. Let's talk about Freud, because Freud is the closest thing this story has to a plot twist. And even that is a low bar. Sigmund Freud, late 19th century, starts working with hysteria patients. And Freud does something almost no other doctor of the era does, which is, he listens to them. He sits down, he lets them talk, for hours. He writes down what they say. And what he starts noticing, in case after case, is that these women are describing trauma. Specifically, in many cases, sexual trauma, often from childhood, often from people in their own households. Freud, to his credit, publishes this. He calls it the seduction theory. He argues that hysteria is not a disease of the uterus. It is a response to trauma. The medical community responds to this by losing its mind. Not at the trauma, at Freud. They reject the theory so hard that Freud himself, within a few years, walks it back. He revises his position to say that maybe these women were not describing real events but unconscious fantasies, which is, and I'm going to use a technical term here, a hell of a pivot. He went from, these women are telling the truth and society is covering it up, to, actually, they're making it up in their heads, inside of a decade. The historical debate over why he changed his mind is still going. The most generous reading is that the social pressure was enormous. The least generous reading is right there next to it. But Freud did one other thing that genuinely scandalized his profession. He suggested, based on his casework, that hysteria could occur in men. Men. The medical establishment, presented with this information, reacted the way you would react if your dentist told you that your car needed a root canal. They were not having it. The entire definition of hysteria was that it came from the uterus. If men could have hysteria, the disease made no sense. And rather than concluding, oh, then maybe the disease has never made sense, the medical community concluded, Freud is wrong and also weird about it. It took until 1980 for hysteria to be removed from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the official American reference book for psychiatric diagnoses. 1980. That is not a typo. The diagnosis hysteria was still in the official American Psychiatric Manual when The Empire Strikes Back came out. A doctor in 1979 could write hysteria on a chart and bill insurance for it. It is younger than the Walkman. I have, at this exact moment, 47 browser tabs open from researching this episode, and I do not. No, I won't. No. Moving on. One of them is a PDF of the 1952 DSM. One of them is a Yale Review article. 3 of them are different versions of the same Wikipedia page that I keep opening because I forget I already had it open. I am not equipped to process this information. I am barely equipped to process my. When hysteria was finally removed from the DSM in 1980, it didn't really go away. It got broken up into a bunch of different diagnoses: conversion disorder, somatic symptom disorder, histrionic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. The catch-all bucket got divided into smaller buckets, and the smaller buckets are still, according to a lot of contemporary research, disproportionately applied to women. Women are significantly more likely than men to be diagnosed with several of these conditions. Women are significantly more likely to have their physical pain attributed to psychological causes. Women are significantly more likely to wait longer in emergency rooms for the same symptoms. The studies on this are not subtle. The wandering uterus is gone. The receipt is still being processed. I'm not going to wrap this up with a lesson. This is not a TED Talk. The lesson is in the date. 2,400 years for the wandering uterus. 81 years for hysteria to leave the DSM after the start of modern medicine. 46 years since 1980. The thing about a diagnosis that exists because it's useful rather than because it's real is that it does not disappear when you delete the word. It just finds new words. And the medical establishment, which spent 2.5 millennia confidently writing down the wrong answer in increasingly expensive textbooks has never once issued a correction. There is no apology chapter in the Merck Manual. There is no footnote. The book just quietly updated and kept going, like a group chat where someone said something unhinged and everyone agreed to never bring it up again. I was going to keep going on this, but I have not eaten today, and I think there's a frozen burrito in the freezer with my name on it.